I'm Melissa Sherbrooke, 36, and I built a career in the shadows, the kind where the work matters and the name never makes the news. For years, I quietly watched over my younger brother from behind a classified screen, tracking every deployment he didn't know I could see, absorbing every joke he made about my desk job in front of people I outranked. Then, one afternoon in a military hangar in Coronado, he tried to make me the punchline in front of his entire team, and his commanding officer snapped to attention and saluted me before he could finish the sentence. Have you ever been dismissed by someone you were silently protecting the whole time? Drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before we get into it, where are you watching from? And if you've ever had to let the room figure out who you actually are rather than argue it, hit like and subscribe. What happened next, in that hangar, might be the last thing you'd expect. My father kept his old Navy books on the bottom shelf so we could reach them. I was the only one who ever did. The house we grew up in sat 6 blocks from the water in San Diego, close enough that the air always carried salt and the sound of aircraft was as ordinary as traffic. My father, Gerald Sherbrooke, had done 4 years of enlisted Navy service before I was born, enough to give him opinions about ships and enough pride to arrange his old books on the lowest shelf of the bookcase like a small museum exhibit. He never talked about going back. He talked about the sea the way men talk about something they used to love, with warmth and no real detail. I was 8 years old the first time I pulled one of those books down, 1996. William was toddling around behind me at 3 years old, already finding ways to make noise about it. The book was a history of Pacific Fleet operations in the Second World War. I kept stopping on a phrase I didn't understand, naval intelligence. I asked my mother. She said, to ask your father. I went to the living room. He said, oh, that's desk work, sweetheart, and pointed at a photograph of flight deck operations. Then William fell into his lap, laughing, and my father laughed too, and the conversation was over. I found a notepad and wrote down the words, naval intelligence, in my neatest printing. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. I didn't want to lose it. That was the whole pattern, right there in miniature. Not a dramatic moment, not even a sad one. Just a room that tilted slightly in one direction every time William walked into it, and me adjusting my footing so quietly that nobody noticed I was doing it. William arrived 5 years after I did, and the effect was immediate. He was loud in the way that people mistake for confidence when it appears in children, and physical in a way that made everyone feel like something exciting was about to happen. My parents loved me. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about bad parents. It's a story about a family that built vocabulary for one kind of service and never thought to build one for another. My father understood what a man on a ship looked like. He had a harder time with a daughter reading about signals intelligence. September of 2001. I was 13, William was 8. We sat at the dinner table 1 week after the attacks, with the television turned toward us. William asked loud questions. Are they going to come here? And, is Dad going to go fight? And my father answered each one patiently. I sat quietly. I watched the footage they kept showing. I thought about how someone had known or should have known or almost knew, and how the gap between almost and actually was the thing that made all the difference. That night I wrote in a notebook, I want to know things before they happen. That's how you protect people. I didn't show it to anyone. William announced his future at the dinner table that week. He was going to fight when he was big enough. My parents smiled at each other over his head. His declaration and my notebook were doing the same work in opposite directions, one visible, one hidden, and the world was going to find his version far easier to celebrate. I applied to the Naval Academy in 2005 and was accepted the following spring. I was 18. My father shook my hand at the kitchen table and said I was going to do great things. My mother cried a little and immediately worried about whether I'd brought enough warm clothes to Maryland. She also reminded me that William's sophomore year of high school started the same week I'd be at plebe summer, as if she needed me to understand she was keeping track of both of us at once. The years at Annapolis were mine in a way almost nothing had been before. I chose the intelligence track in my sophomore year without hesitation. My academic record was strong. I was not the loudest person in any room, which, in an intelligence pipeline, is not a liability. I learned to listen. Graduation was a Friday in May of 2010. I was 22. My parents came. William was 16 and had a travel baseball tournament that weekend, regional team, so they attended the ceremony and left the next morning to drive him to Phoenix. At dinner that evening, my mother said she was proud and spent 10 minutes worrying about William's knee. My father shook my hand and said, "Good job." That was it, 2 words. I was a commissioned ensign in the United States Navy. Same 2 words he gave me when I cleaned my room without being asked. I didn't feel sorry for myself. What I felt was something more practical. My life was going to take place in a register my family didn't have the vocabulary to read, and if I was going to survive that gap without spending all my energy trying to close it, I had to get comfortable with being underestimated. I reported to Naval Station Norfolk in Virginia in the summer of 2011, age 23, an ensign assigned to a fleet intelligence support team. I shared an apartment with a woman named Patricia Nguyen, a lieutenant junior grade building toward similar work. Patricia was sharp and direct and had the useful quality of saying exactly what she thought without making you feel she had rehearsed it. We became friends the way people do in compressed environments, quickly and permanently. The call came in September of 2011. My mother's voice was lifted the way it lifted when she had news she'd been holding. William had enlisted. He was 18. He'd signed his papers and was going to Great Lakes for basic training. Now both my babies are in the Navy, she said, and I heard what that meant to her. I called William. He picked up on the second ring. Don't worry, sis, he said. I'll outrank you soon enough. He was joking. I knew he was joking. He didn't know what rank I held. Ensign, '01, commissioned 2 years before he'd even thought about enlisting. And he didn't understand how officer commissions worked relative to enlisted service. He saw the Navy as a competition. I had always understood it as a vocation. I stood in the hallway with the phone against my ear and looked at the framed commissioning photo on the wall. He had never thought to ask what I actually did. Not once in 2 years of me being in the Navy had he asked a single question about my work. He had filled in the blank the way people do when they're not paying attention. Desk work, paper pushing, the kind of thing that doesn't have a good story, and moved on. Patricia asked about the call at dinner. I told her William had enlisted, that he'd try for the SEAL pipeline eventually, that my parents were thrilled. She asked how I felt. I said I was glad he'd found something that fit him. She looked at me a moment and said, "That's a very diplomatic answer." I said, "I've been in the Navy 2 years, it comes naturally now." She laughed. What I didn't say was that the call had crystallized something I'd been watching build for years. William and I had grown up in the same house with access to the same bookshelves and arrived at the Navy along 2 completely different roads. His road was visible and recognized. Mine was classified at levels my family would never be read into. Those roads were going to cross, eventually. And when they did, I already understood which one of us the room was going to look at first. I put the phone in my pocket. I went back to my desk. I had a brief to finish. I filed the brief. I got ready for the very next one ahead. Between 2012 and 2019, William and I both climbed. We just climbed different structures, at different speeds, with different audiences watching. He rated seamen in 2012 and completed basic training the way everyone expected he would, well and without complaint. By 2013, he had advanced to Petty Officer 3rd Class and was deep in the BUDS screening process. I was a lieutenant by then, '03, 3 years into work I couldn't describe at family dinners, attached to a joint intelligence task force that required me to be in places I couldn't name. He was building towards something visible. I was building towards something effective. We didn't talk much. We weren't estranged, just busy in directions that didn't naturally overlap. 2014 was William's year in the way that years sometimes belong to a person. He completed BUD-S and earned his trident, still rated Petty Officer 3rd Class. My parents put together a backyard cookout in San Diego with extended family and neighbors and William's training classmates, some of whom were still riding the physical high of what they had survived. I drove up from a classified briefing in Washington. I cannot tell you what the briefing was about or where it was. I arrived in civilian clothes carrying a bag I'd packed in an airport locker, and I walked into my parents' backyard looking like someone who had been on a long flight, which was not untrue. My uncle found me near the cooler and asked what I was doing these days. I said naval intelligence. He nodded, and then turned back to watch William demonstrate something with his hands that made 4 people laugh at once. I poured a glass of water. Patricia Nguyen had driven down with me, and she stayed close without being obvious about it. Later, William put his arm around my shoulders and turned me toward a cluster of his training friends. "This is my sis," he said, grinning. "She keeps the lights on at the Pentagon." The friends laughed. Patricia caught my expression from across the yard. I was smiling. I had learned how to make the smile exactly the right size. He wasn't trying to diminish me. I want to say that clearly. William had no framework for what I did and had never felt the need to build one. His world operated on physical courage and team accountability, and the trust you forge in cold water at 2 in the morning. My world operated on information and access and the silence between what you know and what you're allowed to say. Those worlds don't naturally produce curiosity about each other. His didn't produce curiosity about mine. The same year he earned his trident, I received a classified commendation for work I cannot describe here. There was no ceremony. There was no cookout. There was a brief acknowledgement in a closed room from people whose names I will not write down, and then I went back to work. 2015. William deployed for the first time. He shipped out from Coronado on a gray morning in January, and my parents called me that evening to tell me, as if I wouldn't have known. What I didn't tell them was that by the time they were calling, I had already been watching his operational corridor on a classified screen for 6 days. My intelligence element was providing targeting support for the theater he was entering. I couldn't tell them that. I couldn't tell him that. I just said, I know, tell him to be careful, which was the only part of what I knew that I was allowed to say out loud. He sent a postcard from Coronado when he came home. It said, "See, desk jobs aren't so bad." I read it twice. Then I put it in a drawer and went back to work. By 2016, I had been promoted to Lieutenant Commander, 04. William advanced to Petty Officer 2nd Class that year after demonstrated performance on deployment. My parents celebrated his promotion at a restaurant near the harbor and called me on speakerphone. I was in a hotel room in a city I cannot name. I said, "Congratulations." My mother said, "Your brother's doing so well," in a tone that assumed this was information I was hungry for. I said yes. I finished a targeting assessment. 2017. I began building the element that would become Shadow Zero, a classified Joint Special Operations Intelligence Unit, the most substantive work of my career to that point. It took 2 years to reach full operational capability. I was 30 years old when it came together, still months away from making commander. The work required a precision of coordination I had been preparing for my entire professional life, and it occupied me in a way that felt, for the first time, exactly proportional to what I had to give. William deployed again in 2017. I tracked his corridor, said nothing. 2019. I made commander, 05. I was 31 years old, the commanding officer of a classified joint intelligence element with a call sign, Shadow Zero. My parents visited me in San Diego that fall, and I took them to a restaurant near the water. I could not take them to my office. I could not tell them what I commanded or what it did. My father asked if I liked my work, and I said yes, genuinely. He nodded and said that was good, and then spent the rest of dinner asking me whether I thought William should try for a particular additional training pipeline. William was home on leave that same trip. He came by my apartment on a Tuesday and stood in the kitchen making himself a sandwich while I sat on the couch with a laptop open to nothing classified. He looked around at the space, modest, government adjacent, the kind of apartment that signals you spend more time working than decorating, and said, with no particular sharpness, "So what exactly do you do all day? Is it like PowerPoints?" He laughed. I said something agreeable. He finished the sandwich. Thanksgiving that year, my father gave a toast. To William, real service. He caught himself almost immediately and added, "And to Melissa's important work, whatever it is she's allowed to tell us." He meant well. That was the part that was hard to explain to people who hadn't lived inside it. He always meant well. But the addendum, the qualifier, the whatever it is, those words were doing work he didn't intend and wasn't aware of. And by 2019, I had been absorbing them for long enough that they had stopped feeling like accidents. Patricia pulled me into the kitchen at some point during that Thanksgiving. She closed the door. She said, "You know you don't have to keep taking that." I said I wasn't taking anything, that William was just being William. She looked at me. "That's exactly what I mean." Later that night, she drove us back to her apartment, where we both had early briefings the next morning. She asked why I never pushed back even a little, even in the small ways available to me. I gave her the answer I always gave. Clearance, family dynamics, it's not worth the fight, she said. That's not the whole reason. She was right. I sat with the question for a while and said, if I start correcting them, it becomes a fight about what I can't say. It's easier to let them think what they think. She was quiet for a moment. Then, easier for who, exactly? I didn't answer her that night. I went to bed and slept without dreaming a professional skill. But Patricia's question stayed somewhere in the architecture of the following years. Not loud enough to force an answer, but persistent enough that I never stopped hearing it. I drove home alone that morning. The radio was off. A Navy recruiting billboard went past on the highway, a SEAL in a wetsuit, standing at water's edge, the kind of image designed to make you feel the weight and rightness of physical courage. I didn't slow down. I had a brief to give at 0800. In April of 2024, I flew out to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado to deliver a classified intelligence brief to a SEAL team preparing for a high-value target operation. The team operated under Naval Special Warfare Command. Their commanding officer was a Navy Captain 06 named Eric Owens, A man I had communicated with through proper channels for the better part of 18 months. I had never met him in person. He had never met me. That was not unusual in my line of work. A lot of consequential relationships in the intelligence community are conducted entirely through secured lines and formatted reports. What was unusual was that I had learned, 6 months prior, through normal operational channels, that one of the operators assigned to the executing team was my brother. I flagged the potential conflict of command concern to my superior, Rear Admiral James Holt. He heard it, thought about it for approximately 12 seconds, and told me to travel to Coronado in person and brief the team commander directly. The conflict issue would be resolved at that level. He was not concerned about it professionally. Neither was I. What I was, quietly, and without discussing it, was aware that the operational and the personal were about to share a room for the first time in my career. I arrived early. I always arrived early. The hangar was large and smelled the way operational hangars always smell: gun oil and neoprene, and something metallic underneath both. The team's kit was spread across the deck. Plate carriers at various stages of dress, comms gear laid out with the particular deliberateness of people who have done this enough times to stop finding it interesting. 6 or 8 team members were present, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people whose adrenaline management is a long-trained skill. Captain Owens was at a folding table near the back of the hangar, carefully reviewing a document. I noted him but did not approach. The briefing room door was locked. I waited near the gear cages with my briefcase and my badge unclipped, watching the team work without introducing myself. I had been in 100 operational hangars that looked exactly like this one. Not one had my brother's name on a kit bag. He came out of the equipment room maybe 4 minutes after I arrived. He crossed the hangar floor with the particular movement of someone who has spotted something unexpected and is deciding how to use it. He was 30 years old, petty officer first class, and he looked exactly the way he had always looked, like someone the room was going to organize itself around. He slung his arm around my shoulders and turned me toward the nearest cluster of his teammates like I was a prop in a bit he was working out in real time. "Hey," he said, "this is my sister. She works for the Navy, 2 desk work, intelligence stuff. She's getting the grand tour today." The teammates looked up. A couple of them nodded with the polite disinterest of people who have more important things to track. One asked, "What branch?" William answered before I could. "The kind that doesn't deploy." He was laughing. It was landing the way he intended it to land. He looked at me then with that particular grin, the one he'd been refining since he was 8, and said, "Go on, sis. Tell them your call sign." "She's got this call sign. I don't even know what it is, but she's very serious about it." He was performing. He thought he was being charming. He thought I would laugh and play along, and then the joke would land and the guys would go back to their kit. I looked at him. I glanced at the loadout on the deck. I knew exactly what this team was being sent to execute because I had built the package that told them how. I looked back at William. "Shadow Zero," I said. I said it the way you state a fact. No emphasis, no performance. 2 words that were simply true. He didn't recognize it. I watched that in his face the name meant nothing to him, and he was already working out how to extend the bit, how to use my straight-faced delivery as the next step in the joke. One of his nearby teammates had gone still. 2 others exchanged a look I recognized. Something had shifted, and they weren't sure yet what it was. Captain Eric Owens had been moving toward the briefing room. He stopped. He turned. He had heard the call sign. He knew exactly what Shadow Zero was, because his team had been operating on the intelligence package that element produced for months. He looked at the woman in the dark jacket holding the hard-sided briefcase, and he understood, in the way that senior officers understand things quickly and completely, what he was looking at. He crossed the hangar floor. He came to attention. He saluted. "Commander Sherbrooke." "Ma'am." He did not explain. He did not need to. He turned his head and looked at William, who was standing with his arm still around my shoulders, the grin not yet gone from his face, and said, in a voice that was completely level, completely without heat, "Petty officer, drop your kit. You're off this op. Conflict of command." The hangar went quiet. William's arm came off my shoulders. The team straightened without being told to, the way teams do when something in the air shifts register. Captain Owens looked back at me. "Ma'am, the briefing room will be open in 5 minutes. Then he walked back to his table as if the last 60 seconds had been a routine administrative matter, because professionally, it was. I did not look at William. I did not feel the need to. I set my briefcase on the edge of a cleared table and waited for the briefing room to open. And I thought about the target package I had come to deliver, and I thought about the fact that I had flown across the country for a professional obligation and that the professional obligation was going to be met. When the room opened, I walked in. The team filed in behind me minus William. I stood at the front of the room. I displayed my credentials. I opened the briefcase. I delivered the full target intelligence package. Threat assessment, high-value target profile, pattern of life analysis, exfiltration corridor risk. I was precise. I was complete. I took 3 questions. I answered all 3 clearly. I thanked the room, closed the case, and walked out. I had given many briefs in many rooms. That one was not the hardest. The only unusual thing was that my brother was sitting outside the door. The team filed out of the briefing room in the organized quiet of people who have a job to do. I stood for a moment at the front of the empty room, with the display dark and the briefcase closed. The hangar door was open when I walked back out. Through it, I could see the aircraft on the tarmac, crew moving around them with the deliberate calm of a final pre-mission check. William's teammates walked past me in small clusters, headed toward the flight line. They did not look at me. They had a job. I had done mine. William was sitting on a crate just outside the hangar door, his kit bag at his feet where he had dropped it when Captain Owens gave the order. He did not look up as his teammates walked past him toward the aircraft. He watched them go with an expression I recognized, not shame exactly, not yet, but the precursor to it. The moment when a person understands that something has happened they cannot manage their way out of. I went back through the hangar to sign out of the classified space. I logged the brief, secured my credentials. By the time I walked back through, the aircraft were starting their engines. The sound filled the hangar and then moved south toward the flight line. I stood at the open hangar door and watched them go until the engine sound faded south. William was still sitting alone on the crate. I crossed the hangar floor and William did not look up until I was 10 feet away. Then he did, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He had been sitting on that crate since Captain Owens gave the order. His kit bag was on the ground where he'd dropped it, the straps splayed out on the concrete. Outside, the aircraft had gone. The hangar was quiet now, with the particular quality of a large space that was recently full of people and is no longer. 2 maintenance personnel were working at the far end near a secondary door, and they were not paying attention to us. I was glad for that. I set my briefcase down beside me. I did not sit. He looked like he had been working through several different opening lines and discarding all of them, which was accurate. I didn't know you were, he started. I didn't know what Shadow Zero was. I know, I said. I didn't know Owens was going to. That's the protocol, William. It had nothing to do with me asking him to. There's a chain of command conflict when the intelligence officer delivering a package has a blood relative on the executing team. He applied the standard. That's all that happened. He looked at the floor. He nodded. He was trying to determine whether this was a situation he could recover from through the usual means, humor, deflection, forward motion, and he was beginning to understand that it was not. How long have you outranked me? He asked. I thought about the question. It was not a complicated one. I was commissioned as an ensign in 2010, I said. You enlisted in 2011. Officer commission predates enlisted rank in terms of grade. I've outranked you for your entire military career. He sat with that. I let him. What exactly is Shadow Zero? He said. A classified joint intelligence element. I command it. The call sign is operationally assigned and isn't something I can discuss in detail. And you built the package for this op. My element built it. Yes. Another silence. He looked at the kit bag and then back at me. Why didn't you ever say anything? Not the classified stuff, just that you did something like this. I looked at him. I said, when would I have, William? You never left room for a different answer. He didn't respond to that immediately. He knew what I meant. He had called me a desk jockey at family dinners for years. He had answered questions about my work before I could answer them myself. He had filled in the blank with what was comfortable and stopped looking for anything that might complicate it. I was not angry about it, standing there in that hangar. Anger would have required more energy than I had available, and the situation didn't call for it. What it called for was honesty, and I was prepared to give him that. I told him within what I could say a version of the truth. Not the classified version, just the human one. I told him I had known about his deployments. I told him I had tracked his operational corridors through my work, that I could not say more than that, but that from 2015 onward I had known, at some level, where he was. I watched his face while I said it. I was not looking for a particular reaction. I was just done pretending the information didn't exist. You knew where I was? He said. I knew the corridors, the general operational areas. I couldn't have told you the specifics even if I'd been allowed to, and I wasn't allowed to. But you knew? Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the maintenance crew at the far end finished whatever they were doing and left. We were alone in the hangar now. The overhead lights made their low, constant sound. You never said anything, he said, at any of the dinners, when I made jokes. I just sat there, I said. Yes. He looked like he was arriving somewhere he had not planned to arrive. Why? I thought about that question. It had multiple true answers, and I wasn't sure which one was most accurate. At first it was protocol, I said. You can't explain classified work at a dinner table. Then it became habit, and at some point I paused. At some point it stopped being about what I could or couldn't say, and started being about the fact that no one was asking. I let that sit without adding to it. He clearly heard it. He looked at his kit bag. He was not a man who cried, that was not a criticism. It was just a fact about him, but there was something in his face that was working hard to hold its shape. I'm sorry, he said, for the joke, for all of it, the years of it. I know, I said. I meant that plainly. I believed him. An apology at the end of a long pattern does not undo the pattern, but it is not nothing, and I was not going to make nothing out of it by refusing to receive it. That evening I called Patricia from my hotel room near the base. She asked how the brief had gone. I said it had gone cleanly. She said, and William? I said he'd been pulled. There was a pause she had been read in on, enough to know what that meant, and then she asked how the conversation in the hangar had gone. I told her. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. How do you feel? She asked when I was finished. I thought about it, like I've been carrying a box that someone just noticed I was holding. A pause. So put it down, she said. I didn't answer that directly. I looked out the window at the Coronado night, the lights of the bridge in the distance, a helicopter crossing the sky. I thought about a decade of classified screens and deployment corridors and dinner tables where I'd smiled and said nothing. I thought about the word habit and how habits aren't the same as choices, even when they look like them from the outside. I didn't pick it back up that night. That was not exactly the same as putting it down, but it was a beginning. The helicopter disappeared south. I set the phone on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet. Outside, the base carried on with its nighttime sounds, a vehicle, a distant engine test, the ordinary machinery of a place that does not stop. Usually after a completed operation, I would review notes, read something, sleep early. That night I just sat. I thought about William's face when I told him I had known where he was. The information had reorganized something in him. I could see it happening in real time, the way you see someone reread a sentence they thought they understood. He had spent years constructing a version of me that made his jokes harmless. The desk jockey sister, the paper pusher, the one who stayed safe while he did the hard thing. That construction required me to be completely unaware of his world. I was not unaware. I had been watching it from a classified distance for almost a decade. The joke only ever worked if I was the one left out. I was not the one left out. I was simply the one who hadn't said anything about it. William was going to do something with what had happened. I didn't know yet what shape that would take. He would have to move through it somehow, process it the way he processed everything, through action and through people whose judgment he trusted. That was his to manage. What was mine was the smaller question of what I was going to do differently. I didn't have the answer that night. I just knew that I was done performing a smaller version of myself for people who had never bothered to ask about the larger one. My mother called on a Thursday afternoon in late April. I was back in Washington, still in uniform from a morning meeting, standing in my kitchen with a glass of water when her name appeared on my phone. I answered on the second ring. She had heard a version of events from William that he'd been removed from an operation because of something to do with my work, that there had been a scene in a hangar, that someone had saluted me. Her tone was the careful tone she used when she wasn't sure what she was walking into. She asked what had happened. I thought for a moment about how to say it. Then I said, my command provided the operational intelligence package for William's team. Standard conflict of command protocol required him to step off. No one did anything wrong. A pause. But they saluted you, she said. I'm a commander in the U.S. Navy, Mom. That happens. Another pause, longer. What is a commander? What does that mean? It's an 05. 3 pay grades above where I started. In the Navy, it's the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel in the Army. She was quiet for a moment, and I let her be quiet. I could hear her thinking in the way I had always been able to hear her, think the small sounds of someone reorganizing information that doesn't fit where they put it before. Are you some kind of boss? She asked. I command an intelligence element. Yes. I'm responsible for the people in it, and the work it produces. Quote, why didn't you ever say? Her voice was not accusatory. It was something closer to bewildered. I closed my eyes for a second. The answer was long, and the version I was willing to give was short, so I gave the short one. You never asked, Mom. The line went quiet. I heard her breathing. After a moment, she said, "I'm going to call your father." I said, "Okay." We said goodbye. I stood in the kitchen for a while after, the phone face down on the counter, the water going warm in my hand. The conversation was not the confrontation I had imagined, when I had imagined it, which was not often, and always hypothetically. It had not been explosive or tearful or large in any of the ways that confrontations in my family tended to be when they happened. It was just a gap, closing slowly, with a lot of space on either side of it. William texted me the following week. His team had returned from the operation. The message said, "Mission went. Brief was solid. Just wanted you to know. No apology, no fanfare. Just information, offered without drama, which from William was a form of respect." I read it 3 times. I typed back, "Good." I sent it. I put the phone in my pocket. I needed some space from him, and I needed the space to be honest rather than performed, so I didn't add anything else. I told Patricia about both of those communications when we got coffee the following Thursday. She listened, coffee held in both hands, and when I finished, she said, "How did it feel?" Saying, "You never asked to your mother?" I thought about it. "Factual," I said. Patricia laughed a short, real laugh that was not polite. "That's you," she said. It was the right answer. She asked what was going to happen now. I said I had no idea. She said, "Yes, you do." I said maybe I did and maybe I didn't, and she gave me the look she gives when she thinks I'm being more diplomatic than necessary, but she's willing to let it pass. What I knew, without being fully able to articulate it yet, was that I was done carrying the box. I had been using that phrase to myself since the night I called Patricia from the Coronado hotel, done carrying the box, and I had not fully unpacked what it meant. What it meant was this. For years I had been absorbing a dynamic that cost me something and giving nothing in return to the people producing it. Not rage, not correction, not even the low-level friction of someone who isn't going to let a thing slide. Just silence, smooth and professional, and completely self-erasing. That was over. Not because I was going to start confronting people. Not because I was going to deliver corrective speeches at Thanksgiving. Just because I had decided, somewhere in a quiet hangar on a Tuesday afternoon in April, that the version of me that had been showing up to family events for 20 years was not the accurate one, and I was tired of lending it my face. Gerald called in late May. I was on my couch on a Sunday evening when the phone rang, which meant he had been sitting with this for 3 weeks before picking up. He did not open with a question. He said, "I looked up what a commander is." A pause. "You're 3 ranks from admiral." In a simplified way, yes, I said. "I didn't know that," he said. "I know." Another long pause. Gerald Sherbrooke was not a man who apologized with frequency or fluency. He had to circle the thing a few times before he could say it. I knew this about him. I had known it my whole life. I waited without helping him. "I should have asked more," he said finally, "about what you were doing, over the years." "Yeah," I said. I did not soften it. I did not say it was fine or that he couldn't have known or that it didn't matter. Because it wasn't fine. And he could have known. And it did matter. What I offered him was the honest syllable without the cushioning around it, and I thought that was fair. He received it without argument. We talked for 10 more minutes about nothing consequential, his garden, a neighbor's dog, whether I needed anything, and then we said goodbye. I sat for a while after that one too. The box was on the table. I was not holding it anymore. I did not know yet what to do about the space in my hands, but the first thing was to notice it was there. I went to work the following Monday the way I always went to work, early, by choice, before most of the building was occupied. The classified workspace had a particular quality at 0600, a kind of productive silence that the later hours dissolved. I made coffee and carried it to my desk and opened the first file of the day. There was a new tasking from Rear Admiral Holt's office. There was a follow-up report from the Coronado operation that I needed to review and sign off on. There was a personnel matter in the element that needed attention before the week's end. This was the other thing I had been carrying, alongside the family dynamic. The idea that I had to keep the 2 parts separate, the professional and the personal, the part that worked and the part that waited to be recognized. I had kept them so separate for so long that they had stopped feeling like they belonged to the same person. But they did. They had always belonged to the same person. Commander Melissa Sherbrooke had commanded Shadow Zero for 6 years. She had built the element from 12 people and a concept brief into a 40-person joint unit producing actionable intelligence across multiple classified theaters. She had been commended 3 times in restricted proceedings. That was the professional half. The personal half had spent 6 years absorbing jokes about desk jobs from a brother who never looked past the surface of her life, and smiling at dinner tables while her father toasted real service, and saying nothing because it was easier than the alternative. Those two halves were the same person. It was about time they started acting like it. I signed off on the Coronado report at 07:45. I forwarded it to Rear Admiral Holt's office. I looked out the window at the gray Washington morning, gray and indifferent and completely itself, and I thought, all right then, here we go. June came and the operational tempo didn't slow, which was normal. The work didn't slow because family situations happened. That was something I had understood from the beginning of my career and had never found particularly hard to accept. You compartmentalize, not because you don't feel things, but because the work requires the part of your brain that feels things to step aside temporarily, and you are trained to make it do that. By the first week of June, I was 3 briefings into a new tasking, and the Coronado brief was filed administratively and complete. What was not complete was William. He didn't call in June. He texted twice, once to ask if I'd be at my parents' for the 4th of July weekend, which I would not, and once to say he'd gotten back into the training rotation after being cleared from the conflict of command hold. Both texts were factual and brief. Neither required anything from me. I responded to both in kind. I did not feel the absence of a larger conversation. I had said what I needed to say in the hangar and in the hotel room that night, and the rest of it was his to work through at whatever pace that took. I found out later, he told me himself, months after what he had been doing in those weeks. He had been researching. He had sat down at his laptop in his apartment near the base and looked up what he could find in public records about my career. The Naval Academy class of 2010, open source references in naval news to assignments I had held before the work went fully classified. A commendation citation from 2017 Lieutenant Commander M. Sherbrooke redacted in every substantive line, but the name was there and the date was there and the organizational context told him enough. He closed the laptop and went for a run and ran 6 miles and came back without any answers, which was appropriate because the run wasn't going to produce answers. It was just what he did when something required more space than his apartment contained. He did not call me after he found the commendation. I didn't expect him to. Some things take longer than a phone call to process, and William had always been someone who needed to move through information physically before he could talk about it. That was not a criticism, it was just how he was built. In July, he drove to Coronado to meet a former Bud S instructor named Dale Rourke, a senior chief petty officer, E8, now in his early 50s and retired from active instruction. William had known Rourke since selection. Rourke was one of those people with no investment in managing anyone's feelings who said things with the directness that long service sometimes produces in people who have had to deliver hard news in important moments. They met at a coffee shop. William told him the hangar story. He told it without spinning it, which was notable. William was someone who could spin almost anything, and he didn't. Rourke listened without expression. When William finished, Rourke asked, "What rank is she?" "Commander," William said. "Oh, 5. Rourke nodded once. "She outranked you before you were dry from the ocean." William said he had never thought about what she was actually doing. Rourke said, "That's the problem right there." He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. The verdict was entirely complete. Meanwhile, in Washington, a Tuesday in mid-July, I was at my desk by 06:30. Rear Admiral Holt stopped by my office at around 1000 hours to say, in passing, that the Coronado operation had concluded and the after-action assessment had validated the target package completely. He said, "Good work on the package. It held up." I thanked him. He moved on. That was the professional reality of what had happened in that hangar. It was a footnote, a correctly handled conflict of command situation, a clean brief, a successful operation. In my professional life, it was unremarkable in the way that good work is usually unremarkable. It doesn't make noise when it goes right, only when it goes wrong. The hangar had been a turning point in my family. In my career, it was a Tuesday. In August, William reached out again. I was on a weekend run, stopped near the river, when his message came through. He had found the public pieces of my career online, the Naval Academy record, the redacted commendation, the parts of my life that were visible if anyone had cared enough to look. He said he hadn't known. He said he was sorry. And for once, the apology didn't arrive wrapped in excuses. It was plain, it was late, but it was real. I told him I knew he hadn't known, and that was the part that needed to change. After that, something in me settled. Not fixed, not healed, just quieter. I finished the run alone, thinking about how long I had mistaken dread for wisdom. For years, I had avoided the honest conversations because I thought silence was discipline. But at some point, silence had stopped being professional and started becoming a smaller version of myself. William asked to meet me in September. We chose a restaurant near the water and arrived separately, which felt more important than it should have. For once, we were not being folded into the old family shape. We were just two adults sitting across from each other with a table between us and too much history in the room. The first few minutes were careful. We talked around the real subject: work, training, schedules, nothing that mattered. Then William admitted he had practiced a speech on the plane and that it had not helped. That broke something open. Not dramatically. Just enough. He asked about the academy, about the intelligence track, about the early years of my career, and what I could tell him without crossing lines. I was not allowed to cross. He listened in a way he had not listened before. He did not interrupt. He did not make jokes. He did not fill the silence with the version of me he had already decided was true. Eventually, he asked the question I knew was coming. Had I tracked his deployments? I told him the truth, at the level I could. I knew his operational corridors. I had known the general areas since his first deployment. I could not tell him specifics, and I could not have told him then, but yes, I had known. He asked if I was scared. I said yes. He looked at me and said he had not known I cared that much. I told him he had never asked. It was not a punishment. It was not a speech. It was just the truth, and this time, he had enough room in himself to hear it. Later, walking by the water, he told me he wanted to do better. I asked what that meant. He said he would ask when he did not know something about my work, instead of filling in the blank himself. That was it. That was the whole thing I had needed for 20 years. It was not resolution. It was the beginning of something that might become trust. I knew better than to confuse a foundation for a finished structure. Still, the foundation was there. And for one night, that was enough. The next morning, I ran before sunrise and thought about what different would actually look like. Not better in the vague way people use that word when they want comfort. Actually different. William asking instead of assuming. My parents slowly building the vocabulary they should have built years ago. Me showing up to family events as the accurate version of myself, not the softened one I had used to keep everyone comfortable. October came with full work and changed light. The element had new tasking, fresh questions, deadlines, reviews, and meetings. The professional world did not stop because my family was learning how to see me. That was one of the strange truths of the whole thing. The hangar had changed my family. In my career, it had been a properly handled conflict, a clean brief, and a successful operation. Both things were true, they just mattered in different proportions. One morning, a new analyst asked if Shadow Zero was really my call sign. I said yes. She called it Sirius. I told her it was just a name. Then I sat alone afterward, thinking about the hangar, about saying those same two words there, and how a name can be just a name and still change the way an entire room understands you. Patricia noticed the difference before I fully did. We were running one morning when she said I seemed different. When I asked how, she said I looked like I was no longer apologizing for something. That stayed with me. She had watched for 13 years while I absorbed jokes, dismissals, and half-recognitions. She had seen the cost before I could name it. Now she was seeing the absence of it. My mother changed too, slowly. She called and asked if I was happy in my work. Not what I did, not whether I was busy, whether I was happy. I told her yes. She said she was proud of me and should have said it more. I did not rush to soften it for her. I simply said thank you and let myself receive what had been overdue. Later, William called instead of texting. He brought up the Thanksgiving toast from years earlier, when Dad had said real service, and William had laughed. He said he thought about that now. He said he was sorry. Then he told me he had mentioned me to his team only what he could say, and when they asked what my element was called, he told them he did not know. He asked if that was the right answer. I laughed and told him it was exactly right. That mattered. He had gone from filling in the blanks to respecting that some blanks were not his to fill. A card came from my mother that same week. She wrote that she wished she had asked more, and that she was asking now. So I wrote back, 2 full pages, by hand. I told her about the academy, about the work, about the satisfaction of finding a place that used the exact version of me that existed. Near the end of the week, I accepted an invitation to go out with colleagues. It was ordinary, which was why it mattered. I had spent years separating work from the rest of me so completely that even ordinary connection felt like risk. That night, I showed up. I laughed. I stayed present. I did not manage the room by making myself smaller. Walking home, I thought about the old postcard from William, the hangar, the call sign, the years of waiting for someone to ask. I had spent a long time making myself easier to overlook and calling it professionalism. Some of it was just habit. I was done with that. I did not need a salute to know what I had earned. I only needed to stop pretending I had not earned it. The clarity had come in stages: the hangar, the hotel room, the calls, the dinner, the letter, the quiet yes to a Friday invitation. None of it was a single, clean ending. But together, it pointed me in the right direction. I was Commander Melissa Sherbrooke. I had done the work for 14 years. I had loved it. I had carried knowledge, fear, duty, silence, and family history all at once. And for the first time, people were finally asking. It turned out I had a lot to say. Years of family dinners where my brother filled in the blank about my career before I could open my mouth. A decade of deployment cycles I tracked on a classified screen while he sent postcards joking about desk jobs. And one afternoon in a hangar where 2 words ended the bit permanently. I want to hear from you. Have you ever carried someone, quietly done the work, absorbed the jokes, protected them from a distance, and never once been asked what you actually did? Have you ever been in a room where the truth came out not because you forced it, but simply because you stopped hiding it? And if someone in your life has ever underestimated you and then had to reckon with being wrong, tell me what that moment looked like. I want to read every one of those comments. Subscribe for more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.